All right, why don't we get started? I am John Haigh. I'm the co-director of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. And we have, and also it turns out today, rather than just introducing it, I'm actually the seminar, so a little different.
So Edoardo Campanella, I'm a research fellow here, a senior global economist in the real world when I'm not at HKS. And I'm glad to see the room full. I'm sure the free lunch creates also the right incentive, but I hope you have a genuine interest in the topic as well.
Well, the topic that we have today is, as you can see from the headline, Technical Standards, the battle between China and Western democracies for the internet. And we can't, Edo and I were talking a little bit beforehand. We weren't sure whether the topic that attracted all of you was the topic itself or simply the free lunch. But either way, I think we have some interesting things to talk about. A couple of ground rules just for the discussion for you to think about. Some of these seminars, people get up and they talk for 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then have questions at the end. We're happy to take questions as we go through the discussion. So if there's something that you see that you want clarity on, I'd say mostly questions of clarity, but also if you have some comment, I would say feel free to ask it or comment, but generally try to kind of do somebody described it to me as Jeopardy, where you're supposed to ask your question. It has a question mark at the end. So try to keep it to questions of clarification. It is not generally the most scintillating of topics. Most people, when you say, I want to talk about technical standards, they look at you like, oh my God, I'm going to fall asleep. But the reality is what we feel and what we wrote about and what we're talking about today is that standards actually are much more than that, particularly in this context of the internet. We have a paper that was published in Foreign Policy along these lines, and we're continuing to do a longer version of it. That will be available hopefully in the not too distant future. Peer-reviewed articles seem to take forever to get through the system, but you'll be able to find more at that point. So starting today, just to go through this and frame it a little bit, Vint Cerf made this comment. Vint Cerf was one of the original founders of the internet, right? And he made the comment from a technical standpoint, shared vision, guiding the internet's development was that every device on the internet should be able to exchange data packets. And with any other device that was willing to receive them. Universal connectivity among the willing was the default assumption. Okay, so at some level, the whole notion, if you think about like when the original version, the first time this was created and used was really, what Vint Cerf did was they created a system to send an email. Right? And what they did was if you think of an email and you take that email and you break it into a bunch of little packets, right? And you send those packets all over the network, and then they come to the end and they get reassembled and delivered in a letter, right? And if you have the right standards, you should be able to send an email to anybody following those standards, and they should be able to receive it and assemble it at the end. Right, so all of a sudden the standards become really the critical component that enables this vision, right? This vision of universal connectivity. And so if I just follow those standards, you can send it anywhere in the world. Okay, so what are the ramifications of that? Well, there were three things that really drove, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details on this, but there are three things that really drove kind of the massive explosion of data information flows around the world, right? The first was what many of you have probably heard of, Moore's Law. Basically, the number of transistors you can put on a chip has been growing exponentially. It looks linear there. Just keep in mind, this axis is right? So it is growing exponentially at an unbelievable rate. Some people are speculating that we're approaching the limits of physics and it's not clear that trend can continue. Other people are saying the technological progress is such that it will continue for some period of time. Second big thing, so you can process a lot more information with these transistors, right? The second thing is bandwidth, right? And if you look at just the number of internet connectivity, and this is data that stops about 2018, but the bandwidth bits per second. And just to put this in context, this is these are like billions of bits per second, okay? And if you think about, I used to work at AT&T. I'm not your typical academic. I ran AT&T's international operations. I ran new services for AT&T Wireless. And if you think about it, the old telecom systems, they focused on voice over analog networks. And the world changed dramatically because it became data over data networks. And if you look at voice network bandwidth requirements in the scope of all the bandwidth that's being built, it's trivial. It's really a very small piece of the amount of bandwidth you need. But when you start adding pictures and you start adding images and you start adding film clips, those take up large amounts of bandwidth. But the bandwidth has grown, the connectivity between computers and the bandwidth on those connections has grown. Basically, that's also logarithmic, right? So it's growing exponentially. And then the last thing is just memory, right? Computer memory and storage. So all of a sudden, you have all of this growth in the capacity to store information and access that information and process it with transistors and send it over bandwidth. So all of a sudden, you've got this information kind of explosion that grew out of this vision of the internet. In many ways, the technology enabled the vision of the internet that Vint Cerf laid out to be met, right? And if you do information flows, cross-border data flows, in 2005, you had 4.7 terabits per second. I haven't gone back and tried to update this extensively. This is 2014, and it was 45 times larger. You had 211 terabits, right? And it's probably doubled, or probably gone another 45 times larger if I could get data going back, looking at what it is today. So all of a sudden, you have kind of information flows that flow across nations because nations as a whole, their technology companies have adopted the same standards that enable that information to flow, right? So you've got this kind of whole process of that nature. And what that's enabled and what firms have taken advantage of is they built global supply chains built on heavy data information, and they built their businesses on these cross-border information flows. So Facebook is a global company. Meta is a global company. Any of the social media platforms are global companies, and they have the participants on their platforms that stretch around the world, and they share information with one another extensively. And just to put that in context, when you think about trade, if you look at China in 2021, which was the last data I could find, the share of exports as a percent of GDP was almost 20%. That's $3.36 trillion, okay, of exports. And similarly for the United States, it's 11% to 2.55 trillion, right? So you have this kind of increasing global connectivity, both in physical plant space and export activity, but also when you look at the consumer level, I mean, some of these companies are as big in terms of the number of people on their platform as some of the biggest nation states. So what conflict does this set up, right? It sets up a basic notion. The problem, basically, governments, on the one hand, with the internet, you're talking about a unified cyberspace, and you've got all this connectivity across firms, but governments are not unified, right? Governments are highly fragmented in their beliefs and their desire to control information flows, right? They're first of all, they're geographically bounded, and then they have laws within their territory. And so what you have is basically a misalignment, right? You have a misalignment between the definition of a nation state and then a unified cyberspace, okay? And that's what we were trying to explore as we started to think about this paper, this research. And in particular, I'm going to hand it over to Edo, but we started thinking about what does that misalignment mean and what's happening, because all of a sudden technical standards aren't a bunch of engineers writing technical standards to make it work. Standards become much more than that. They become a projection of global power, of geopolitical power. So with that, sorry.
Yeah, so thanks, John. I think this is the key point. So what we try to explore in the paper and what we will discuss in the next 20 minutes or so is who defines and who controls the standards of the internet and why they are so important. In general, as John said at the beginning, standards might seem, technical standard might look like a dry and not so exciting topic, but it's very consequential. Already in the 19th century, Werner von Siemens, a great entrepreneur, said, "He who owns the standards owns the market." Basically, standards are important because they determine what kind of technology will become predominant in the future. They guarantee market shares to national champions. And the problem with standards is that once they get locked in, it's almost impossible to overturn them. Think about, even if it is not very consequential from a geopolitical point of view, but think about the QWERTY keyboard that we all have on our computer. It's not the most efficient keyboard that we could have, but it was introduced in the 19th century to slow down the work of typists to avoid avoid problems of keys jamming, and it has remained with us, even if there were attempts to replace it with something more efficient. And this is what happens with basically any technology. If you look at the history of technical standard, you will find plenty of examples of this kind. China is realizing that setting the standards of the technologies of the future is extremely important to project power. So far, China has been more a standard taker than a standard setter, but it is now trying to reset the standard or set the standard for 5G technologies, for artificial intelligence, quantum computing, smart cities, and the internet. Because if Beijing manages to set the standard for the internet, implicitly it will set the standard also for the technologies of the future. And so that's why there is a popular Chinese saying, according to which third-tier companies make products, second-tier companies make technologies, and first-tier companies make standards. And it's interesting also to see how China is approaching this new role of standard setter. Publicly, it says that we should adopt a win-win, collaborative, and inclusive approach. But privately, and there were leaked conversations in some academic journal, they want to build, to introduce standards that are actually more convenient for their own system, and to build to increase the security of their technology, to increase also the control that China itself has over the technologies of the future. We will hand it over back and forth.
So, okay, I have to apologize up front for the next 3 slides I'm going to walk you through. They are probably to some degree somewhat technical. Some of you may find it incredibly simplistic, and some of you may say, why am I going through this kind of incredibly technical perspective? But I think you need to understand a little bit kind of how the internet operates today, and then what the alternative is that China is proposing, right? And if you look, so I don't know, how many of you have ever heard of the Open Systems Interconnection Model, the OSI model? Okay, so a lot of you understand this, right? And if you think about it, you've got the application layer. This is a standard model that much of the computing world is built on, right? And you've got an application layer, and this is really where the human interacts with the system, right? And so the application layer is it may be an email system, or it may be some other kind of interaction with the internet, right? And you're separating content at this level from the activities at the lower layer of this open systems interconnection, right? So you've got a presentation layer, and a session layer, and a transport layer, and a network layer, and a data layer, and then the physical layer, right? And all of these are connected. And how many of you have heard of the term APIs? Okay, so everybody kind of has a pretty good sense of what an API is. You've got open APIs between the different layers of the stack, and you can transport information. And so you don't really need to know a lot of detail in necessarily all the other elements of the stack. You just need to know how to interact into the API. and then optimize within the portion that you're focusing on, whatever site. Network layer, kind of dumb pipes. And at the physical layer, you certainly also have encryption frameworks to protect the communication so you can't access or see it, right? So that's the basic model, okay? Now, the internet today, like I said earlier, everything gets broken into a packet, right? So when you move from that application layer where things make sense in the holistic way, all of a sudden you take that information, you break it into a bunch of packets. It could go over multiple networks, multiple peering networks, relationships, and get back to the end because you have the session, you have the address, you know all of the pieces. And really all you know, if you're on those lower layers and you're transporting that packet, all you really know is the IP address where the packet is headed and the IP address for replies. And because of the domain name system, they call it DNS, you don't know the exact kind of person tied to the IP address. You only know the IP address, basically, right? So there are encryption frameworks to protect that communications within this. What China is proposing is something very different, okay? This was introduced by Huawei at the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. And what they introduced in 2019, it was voted down. They continue to try to push pieces of this system through in subgroups and in other standard setting organizations and bodies. But the idea is, they call it China's new IP, and it's, first of all, it's blockchain based, okay? And people think that the blockchain actually gives you security, and they're deluding themselves. We have one fellow here, Shlomo Wegman, who ran basically the anti-terrorist financial network targeting for the state of Israel. And she has assured me that blockchain is not necessarily encrypted enough that in a way that you can't access, right? So you've got hard-coded addresses with identifiers, right? So you can start to see not just like an IP address, but who that IP address is associated with. And you can, it's immutable, right? So you have a permanent record given it's on the blockchain. And therefore the domain name system resolution can be based, right? You can look at who did what. Secondly, the information on the packet headers, right? Before you could just see the address, but you couldn't see what's inside the packet. Now you can see what's inside the packet and where the packet is headed and what the address is for replies with basically names, right? And then you have hard-coded addresses and identifier, which enables tracking, and the network can be instructed to disconnect devices or discard packets. If you think about what this implies, it's basically a massive surveillance machine, right? The amount of information that flows to the government, if they want to, and their control over the access to that information is orders of magnitude much higher than it is with the existing internet structure and protocols. I don't know if you want to, Edo came up with a really good analogy that I like. I don't know, we'll see about the mail system, but I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, no, I think a simple way, especially for those who don't have a technical background, to think about the old and the new system is to compare it to the traditional postal system. In the old system, it's like a postman who's supposed to deliver a letter to a specific address. He doesn't know anything. He doesn't know who will receive it. He doesn't know what's inside the letter. He simply delivers the letter. In this other system, what China is proposing, you have the postman who's allowed in a way to open the letter, see what's inside, maybe get some information about the receiver, gets some information about the sender, then he might decide whether to deliver or not the letter. So it's a completely different kind of model, highly centralized, very authoritarian also in a way. And that's why, as we will discuss in a second, it's extremely appealing for countries like Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia. But
I mean, and I don't want to spend much time on the next couple slides, but so when you try to understand what the Chinese aspirations are, I think there's a mixture of views that they express, and it's really hard to sort through kind of what the real perspective is. Look at what they're saying externally. They're saying US officials distorted China's military-civilian integration policy, malicious disregard for facts, placed an embargo on China under this pretext, disrupting and impeding normal economic trade and technological cooperation, born out of Cold War mentality, and so on. What has been said internally is slightly different. Cyber information, military-civilian fusion is the key field and frontier field of military. It's also the most dynamic and potential field. Due to highly monopolistic nature of information technology systems, what Edo was talking about earlier about lock-in and kind of winner-take-all types of markets, the monopolistic nature of information technology systems, it is unlikely there will be two different systems for military and civilian use. So they start to link kind of the civilian side and the military side. Now, I don't want to make it sound as if the US doesn't have some similar aspirations, right? Because I suspect we just maybe don't know as much about it. But I do know that, for example, there are commercial technologies that the Department of Defense is very interested in making sure they're continually developed because they have dual use, what they refer to as dual use, right? They have both military and civilian or national security and civilian kinds of considerations. And it is understandable that nation states, going back to that earlier conflict and misalignment between a unified cyberspace in the interests of nation states that are geographically bounded, it's not surprising that nation states want to have more control over the information that flows within their borders and between different citizens and whatever. I mean, it's not surprising. And then when you think of the unified cyberspace notion, it puts you in the position of, okay, to manage, even if I'm focused primarily internally, I need to manage on a global basis and try to define standards on a global basis to have that type of control that I need because of the massive global information flows that you're seeing, the integration of supply chains and consumers across these platforms.
John, if I may, something that it might be important to emphasize is clearly also in the old system, governments can control to some extent the internet, they can hack the system. The difference between the old IP system, what China is proposing, is that in the Chinese proposal, these surveillance capabilities will be built directly into the system. Whereas in the current system, in a way, surveillance is a sort of degeneration of the system. It is not designed with that purpose in mind. So that might be important to grasp why it's a serious problem from national security perspective, not just a technological perspective.
If you think about the risk of dependence, on the one hand, you can see where there should be a kind of effort to build this global system and ensure the kind of unified cyberspace, et cetera. And the Chinese externally, they're saying, shows clearly, what like the US's limitations on Huawei's ability to sell into the US markets, the trade of semiconductors to China, and the US's attempt to limit it, they're saying shows clearly that the market economy, fair competition principle it claims to champion is nothing but a fig leaf. And then if you think about what you're hearing internally, has a slightly different flavor to it. Without network security, there would be no national security, no stable economic and social operation, and the interest messes that people would not be guaranteed. No matter how large an internet company is, no matter how high its market value is, if it is heavily dependent on foreign countries for its core components, and if the major artery of the supply chain is in the hands of others, it is like building a house on someone else's foundation, right? So there is, and we're in the middle of that kind of right now, since we pulled some of this together even, if you look at the battle around semiconductors and in the transfer of semiconductor technology, where that resides, it starts to, if you want to kind of think of the geopolitical ramifications of that, think about Taiwan and Taiwan Semiconductor, TSMC, and the importance of TSMC as not just a provider of the high-end chips, but also as a critical geopolitical kind of component in the relationship, the US, China, and Taiwan.
So before maybe because we are now about to move to the second part of the problem that is more diplomatic. I don't know if maybe we might see if the audience has any question on the first part, it's a little bit more of the technical dimension of the problem. Okay.
We do have 4 questions. We'll start here and work our way around.
So just for you have a microphone on the table, so you should turn it on.
You should push the button and it should turn
Okay,
green,
perfect.
and
Okay,
you're all set.
that's great.
Okay. So I'm wondering how China's new model of, data exchange would work internationally if they can have like those surveillance tools. Like, wouldn't it be worse for national security that like the new standards would allow them, like everyone to,
So the question, it's an interesting question because what you don't know, first of all, and we'll talk about it in some of the slides coming up, but it's not as if the current mechanisms by which internet standards are set are just going to magically disappear. They're going to continue to function. And so if a large enough proportion of people maintain their relationship to those standards, at the points of interconnection, China would need to be able to, or its entities would need to be able to translate to that IP protocol, right? But at the same time, if they control the kind of structure of this internet within their system, they would be able to see it, but others would not, right? So that's part of the dilemma of how this works. But the current mechanisms by which standards are set are going to continue to operate, and that's what. And we'll talk about what the ramifications of that might be and how that plays out. Marlon.
Hello.
Yeah, that's as much for the Zoom people. You'll have to speak up because there's no.
Okay, so I have 2 quick questions. One is, could you talk about like how the standard is set? Like, is there like a committee or something? What stopped China from just be like, hey, I'm gonna like do the standard like domestically, only when there's like outbound emails and things, I'm gonna do the international standard. Second question is like, it sounds like there's only like downside to the new standard that the Chinese are proposing. What's the upside they're selling, right? Because like for it to get approved.
So I respond on this and I let you respond on the other one. So what the Chinese are saying, because this is something that we do in the paper, we tried also to understand a little bit better the Chinese perspective. So what they say is that the old IP system was introduced at the time when only computer could go online. So it was a completely different world from the current one. So what they are saying is that if you introduce this new China IP system, basically it would introduce a level of flexibility that the current system does not have, and it would improve the quality of the communication between the different devices, because the new IP system would take into account this variety of devices that today can go online, whereas in the old system, for instance, just an iPhone did not exist 20 years ago. So it would improve the efficiency of the communication across different devices. That's what they are saying. Personally, I'm an economist by training, so I'm not the best person to judge the technicalities and the pros of that system, but apparently those who are involved in this negotiation have never been persuaded by this.
Yeah, I mean, China has become more aggressive at the ITU, but they've also become aggressive in other standard setting bodies, which is partially an issue. And we'll talk about the nature of how standards are set shortly. There are 2 things. When it got voted down at the ITU in 2019, one of the things that people said was, you don't have proof that it'll work, right? Now, maybe that's just an excuse to not vote for it. But what China did was go back to China, and they built a 40 node, basically, network within China connecting 40 universities on this standard to prove, it's kind of a proof of concept, right? That it can work. The other thing that you're starting to see with what China's doing, the reason I ask for whom is because you can imagine for China the value of this, right? They can see kind of who's doing what social activity is underway. They've also started to tie this to something they call the social index. And the social index is an articulation of kind of, are you a good citizen kind of notion. And probably not a fair characterization, but it enables them to track behavior against the social index, which obviously would have some benefits for them in terms of social control. So it's appealing in that regard.
And in terms of strategy, to answer your first question as well, it's true, they are trying to introduce these standards domestically because the ambition is that at some point, if they can prove that they actually work, their ambition is to proliferate them externally abroad. So they understood that there is a pushback internationally, so but they don't want to give up, and so they do it first nationally, and then they will see if they get their proposal gain enough traction.
I mean, there are also a number of kind of subtle aspects of benefits. If you go to the WTO, World Trade Organization, the World Trade Organization, if you're part of it, requires that you use international standards in your activities. Okay, and the reason they do that is they don't want countries to create standards that are domestic standards that are used as trade restrictions, right? So if China can push to have their approach become a national standard, then they can require companies operating within China to use that international standard, even though it really is a protectionist approach to domestic activity. So there were two more questions back here.
And then one here in the front, and then we move to the second part.
So I'll comment real quickly. We didn't look at that. At some level, that's almost like a part two of some of the research, because on the wireless side, like I don't know how many of you are following, but Huawei just introduced a new phone, a new smartphone. And it's a good example of the complications in trying to understand the space, right? Because it had 7-nanometer chips in it. And everybody, and we've been talking to a few people, everybody's trying to figure out where do they get the 7-nanometer chips from? Like, and it's a very opaque kind of process. And then overlaid into that is the question around standards as relates to chips and other kind of components that are going into the wireless system. And I don't know the answer to that. We've got work to do to try to figure some of that out. You know, Qualcomm has dominated the chip space for wireless for a long time. So it's not as if the United States isn't protecting kind of, you know, a US company, Qualcomm, and Qualcomm certainly wants to maintain its monopolist kind of, I hesitate to use that word too strongly because I'm not an antitrust lawyer per se, but they certainly have a strong position and they're trying to protect it. And Huawei would like to move them out of that position. And the chip manufacturer, whoever provided them the 7-nanometer chips, I think that's an interesting question that we may have some geopolitical aspects to shortly. We had a question back here, and then we're going to need to move on, but we'll keep leaving time for questions towards the end.
I was wondering, so this is an ideological battle wrapped up in a technological one, but I'm wondering, especially in terms of China, on one hand says that they want foreign companies to come and invest in China. If these are the protocols that they're trying to implement, I mean, it only exacerbates the leaky sieve problem, especially as it relates to IP in China. And so how are they thinking about this in terms of the effects that it'll have on business investments in the country?
So, you know, it's an interesting question because if you look, I mean, at firms operating in China, but you know, if you look at don't think about kind of massive technology kinds of companies. Think of somebody like Volkswagen, right? And Volkswagen is a German company. the largest sales that they have are to China. China is their biggest market. And so what are they going to do if China says you need to follow this set of protocols? Right? Are they going to say no and then run the risk of kind of losing that market share? It's just such a complicated dynamic to sort out. And you know, that's almost a game theoretic negotiating kind of perspective, and those models, when you try to run them, are always difficult to come to resolution. So I don't know if it's not really a good answer to your question,
but you raise also an important point that probably we should have emphasized a bit more. Maybe it's implicit in our presentation, but this is a different battle for setting technical standards compared to the past. It's not only about projecting power. It's not only about gaining market shares. It's really an ideological battle, because you are promoting two different visions of the world, a democratic, open one that is the traditional IP, and an authoritarian, centralized one that is the new China IP. And so that's also important to understand, and this could be a bridge for the second part of the presentation, to understand the diplomatic tension that this is creating. So traditionally, the standards for the internet were set through a voluntary bottom-up multi-stakeholder approach. As John mentioned at the beginning, the technical standards has always been a prerogative of technical experts, engineers, meeting in technical committees, either at the national or international level. And for the internet, it was the same. There are a number of institutions where engineers meet and solve technical problems for the different layers of the internet architecture that John described a few minutes ago. There is, for instance, the Internet Engineering Task Force that is primarily focused on the infrastructure layer. There is the World Wide Web Consortium that is more focused on the application layer. So these are organizations that are characterized by a bottom-up pluralistic consensus approach. And they are primarily dominated by representatives of the private sector. China doesn't only want to change the standards of the internet, it also wants to change the way these standards are decided upon. John already mentioned the ITU. The ITU is a sort of traditional international organization that is dominated by state members. So here at the level of ITU, negotiations are top-down, are not bottom-up, are not multi-stakeholders, are just multinational. So it's a completely different approach. It is also very different from the spirit that animated the internet at the very beginning when it was introduced. As John said, it was considered to be a unified cyberspace where governments were not allowed, at least in theory, to interfere and intervene. The reason why China is focusing primarily on ITU is in part for what John just said, that if standards are agreed upon at the ITU level, basically it will be possible for China to export its internet-related technologies abroad without any further scrutiny. And if you are exporting technologies that allow you, in a way, to control what the citizens in other countries are doing, that's enormous from a foreign policy perspective. And basically, Huawei, as John said, is the key actor in the negotiation at the ITU level. The West is pushing back on different fronts, on the technical side of the problem, but also on the diplomatic side of the problem. Last year, there was the election of the new Secretary General of the ITU. China was pushing for a Russian candidate whose name is Rashid Ismailov, who turned out that he was also an executive at Huawei previously. But in the end, the US managed to let Doreen Bogdan Martin, that it was the candidate for Western democracy, to be elected.
So one thing I just want to talk for a second on the ITU, it is a one nation, one vote kind of body, but you do have a lot of technical subgroups in the ITU, and those are often staffed by some of the same or the types of technical experts you see in these, what we call the multi-stakeholder organization groups like the IETF or the IEE or the World Wide Web Consortium. So you have that technical expertise. And one of the things that has happened is that China is pushing more and more of their firms and their technical experts to engage at the ITU and other places in the technical discussions. They will actually pay firms for their proposed standards proposals into those organizations. And they will also provide technical expertise to write the proposals to make them as strong as possible. On the other side of it, and one of the fellows we have at the center had last year was a former ambassador to the ITU for the United States. And he was saying that the other problem is that a lot of the US companies are somewhat less engaged at the same levels of engineering detail that the other firms are. And so some of the technical experts from the US are simply not showing up. Even from the private sector, some of the engineering technical experts are just not showing up. And if if you want to shape the standards, you got to be at the table, right? And so that is an issue I think the US and Western democracies in general need to think about and address.
So yeah, moving to the conclusion, we have 15, 20 more minutes. In the paper, we make the argument that Western countries should try to build a coalition of the willing to update and upgrade the existing layer and modular internet architecture. It might not be the best architecture, but it has proved to be very adaptable and flexible over time. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, it was introduced for a different world where most of the devices that we are using today were not supposed to go online. But still, that system was able to absorb this new mass of devices that are operating on the internet. It's also very flexible because it's enough to adjust one layer of the architecture without having to redesign the entire system. So if needs change over time, you can just fix what's needed. So basically, our argument, our recommendation is to find ways to improve the current system, but not to replace it entirely. From a diplomatic perspective, it's going to be challenging because there is a risk of splinternet that John briefly mentioned, and maybe we can elaborate also a little bit afterwards. There is a risk of splinternet because last year, the EU, the European Union, the US passed a document a declaration for, it was a declaration for the future of the internet, where we basically they were promoting this idea of preserving an open, free, and democratic internet. That declaration was signed by around 60 countries. Most of them were Western democracies. Few emerging economies sign this declaration, and even China, even India, sorry, didn't sign it. And this means that there is a risk of creating different models for advanced and emerging economies, for democracies and authoritarian regimes. So it's important to find a way to engage as many countries as possible, even the authoritarian regime with whom the West is competing at the moment. So what we propose is a sort of compromise between the traditional standard setting system and what China wants to promote. So we suggest the creation of a layer governance system with the first layer that is more of a traditional system where technical experts meet and discuss technical problems and try to find technical solutions. And then the second layer is where the decisions are being made, and it is more similar to what China is pushing for. And it is a layer where negotiations are primarily among governments. Clearly, it should be a principle-based system, so governments should decide common principle to make a final decision. But we think it's also a more realistic system for today's world compared to the internet of 20, 30 years ago, because also in the West, the governments want to increase their control over the internet because they want to tame the power of big tech companies. They want to build wall to protect their system from cyber attacks. They want to protect the right of their citizens, for instance, when it comes to privacy issue. So that's the reality. It's no longer a system where only private companies and technical experts can deal with this sort of issue. Governments need to play a role. And so we think that this might be a sort of compromise to keep all these different things together. I don't know if you want to elaborate or move.
I mean, I do think the weakest part of what we're trying to figure out is, what do you do, right? How do you build a system that can maintain some of the universality of cyberspace, while at the same time, how do you maintain the kind of universality of cyberspace, but recognize the kind of focus of individual nation states on the activities within their nation state where they have the right to control those activities, right? And that's the fundamental tension that we were talking about at the start. So it's hard to figure out what the solution is to addressing that conflict, that misalignment, right? And we don't have a good, I mean, this is too many words on the slide, but you know, it's basically a small d democratic response. You know, you need to kind of develop a strategic plan. Right now, nobody's really thinking in an integrated way about how to address the problem. Or, for example, as Edo was saying, in that second layer, you know, what are some of the basic principles that we might be able to reach out to other countries and find agreement, certainly among Western democracies, maybe more broadly. Secondly, you just got to engage. How do you motivate kind of firms, companies, academics, and others just to engage in the process of setting standards in that first layer that Edo talked about? And secondly, those of you who have worked in government understand that this is like an incredibly difficult task to create an interagency task force of some sort, or a highly coordinated interagency effort, because it cuts across so many dimensions. It's not just a technical standard. It's not just the, you know, one of the people we have here is Tom Wheeler, who is the former chair of the Federal Communications Commission, right? And he just rolls his eyes when you talk about interagency task forces, right? Because they just generally don't work very well. But you need to find a way to coordinate across agencies. And then you have to understand it's a long-term proposition, that you're not going to solve this tomorrow, that it's going to just be something that's going to require focus over time. So, but any suggestions on how to solve this, we would love to hear hear your response. So we've got a few minutes for questions.
So we had the person.
Yeah, we'll work our way around. I saw.
Hi, I'm Sinlu. I'm MPP student at HKS. Two questions. So from your presentation, I sort of get that there are like two battlefields within this like internet. The first is within the existing standards that we have, how we want to improve that, and also standard setting for technology that has not have standard like AI and whatnot. And given that China, my observation of China is that they love pilot projects and like doing things first and then coming out with evidence for you to like persuade you otherwise. So how do we, and they have the resources to do that, since they have usually a top-down approach to their companies and stuff. So how do you counter that when I guess like you say, a lot of American companies are not that involved in like standard setting, it's not a priority for them. And the second thing is in spaces where there are no standards, how do we prepare for that? And like, given that China is also very strong on their infrastructure building in terms of like undersea cable and stuff like that, how do you counter that if the infrastructure is built by them and then now they want the dominance is also the yeah.
So we're driving on a kind of standards perspective. And I think your point about China running pilots is absolutely true. And if you look, like, for example, I told you that they're doing this 40 university backbone proof of concept to prove that their new IP works, right? Another thing that they're doing, and they're starting to tie it into different areas, and Tim Massad's here, who's doing digital assets work. But if you look at the People's Bank of China, they have a partnership with Huawei to try to build a standard-based payment system in the new IP, right? So this is a kind of skunkworks pilot kind of testing ground where they're trying to push that forward. Will it go anywhere? I mean, who knows, right? So what the response is, and this is the comment earlier, is I think right on target about, this is not just a standards battle, it's kind of an ideological battle. And our approach in the US is very much kind of competition, choice, markets, people self-organizing to decide what's in their interest versus the top-down approach you describe in China. And I think it'll be interesting to see. You have to think about what the incentive structures are within the US, and you have to motivate the parties by supplementing those incentives. I tend to think a little bit, I'm a businessman, but I tend to think a little bit like an applied economist. And I think incentives are incredibly critical in these kinds of environments. So if you think of an externality, there's a social benefit to more coordinated activity. I think this is a kind of critical industrial policy question for the United States. How should it step in and aggressively support more firms, funding firms to provide standards? I'll give you an example of something that happened at the ITU. In one of these subgroups, there was a battle over what the standard should be. And they were going to vote. And you need to understand the ITU is consensus driven, and it's also collaborative and it's voluntary, right? So if you don't you don't have to comply, but then you run this risk of this massive fragmentation of the system, right? And there was a vote on a standard. There was a Huawei standard and a Qualcomm standard. And the chairman of the committee above the committee that was voting had to step in because Huawei was requiring people, when they went into the voting booth, to take a picture of their ballot to prove they had voted for Huawei, right? And so the person above that had to step in and say, you're not allowed to take your phones into the voting, right? And then they did something they've never done before. They both basically kind of approved both standards, right? But that's, again, pushing you down this path of increasing fragmentation, kind of that you're seeing it in multiple dimensions, global supply chains, global trade, that push to reshore, things like that. And this is just a kind of cosmic, a microcosm of some of that around the standard side of it. I don't know if you want to.
No, because we are a little bit short of time. Maybe we can take a couple of questions.
We'll go Tim, and then back here and over here.
So I did want to ask a question kind of on the idea of using the internet to transfer value, because what's happening in the digital assets crypto space is people are saying increasingly, well, if there really is value to tokenizing assets and moving them around, whether that's stable coins or other things, we have concerns about decentralized blockchains because there's no governance, there's no standards, there's maybe lack of resilience. So why can't we have something like the internet where there are standards, except where they want to take that actually is to address concerns about anonymity in part, right? I mean, in other words, if we're going to use blockchains for the financial system, we have to have greater transparency. We have to know, who's transacting at least above a certain value. So in a sense, yeah, in a sense, it's kind of ironic because it's almost some of the things you're saying China wants that you don't want generally for information.
You do one for payments.
You do one for payments. So how do you, I don't know. I just thought I'd throw that out and see how you reconcile that.
So I don't have a good way to reconcile it necessarily. I do know, for example, we were talking to some people, and IPv6 is kind of a version of kind of some internet standards. And I was told off the record that the encryption standards in IPv6 were not as strong as they could have been, primarily because of national security concerns that the US had, in particular the Department of Defense. And so the encryption standards were not made as strong. So there is this balancing act, and what's the right balance? Because you can imagine you do need to have know your customer kinds of requirements around payment systems and asset transfers and all that kind of stuff. And that's at the heart of this. Like that's where, I don't know if Edo would agree, but my bias would be maybe there's enough common ground there that we could sit down and have at least some discussion of what principles would be across authoritarian regimes as well as democratic regimes to kind of set some guidelines on what these might look like. But I don't have a good answer.
So there were a couple over there.
And so other telecom companies in the country have not used Huawei. They've used other third-party like Qualcomm or even European standards. So this idea of standards coexisting even in one country, do you see that as a possibility? I mean, no one, like all these countries say, we don't want to choose between the US and China. We want to have relationships with both. Even US companies don't want to have to be sort of segmenting their markets within that region, right? So just getting a perspective on that kind of question of what's the reception in third countries and from their perspective, business choices.
The greatest challenge is related to the cost of having two parallel systems running together, because if you're a company, you're likely, you don't want maybe to lose access to the Chinese market. You don't want to incur in the cost of having to develop different internal information systems to be able to run on both standards. So I think ideally, from a business perspective, I guess the best solution is to decide one single standard, ideally the best one that protects also the activity of the companies and doesn't allow maybe the government to interfere with what you're doing. But having two parallel systems running together, I think it can be extremely expensive.
It's both expensive, but the other thing I would say is, it's what we were talking about earlier about you have a global kind of system around supply chains and consumer bases, the B2C, B2B kind of questions. And it's not as if the current IP structure and protocol structure is going to go away. So if you're operating in a global system, so take Thailand, it's not operating just within its borders. And so at some point, it has to interconnect to the networks of the rest of the world. And so if those networks are running on current IP infrastructure, you're going to have to figure out how to manage that translation to engage. And you can only do that if you operate within their IP structure. So it pushes you towards a kind of winner-take-all side, and it only can work to run parallel systems or pick an alternative system if you don't feel like you need to interact with the current IP infrastructure, right? Which is potentially limiting on economic growth and other kinds of economic development that countries want to build. So it kind of creates this morass of, it's going to be confusing, I think, and complicated for the next decade as this kind of moves forward and gets sorted out.
So we have a question. Anyone else?
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry here.
So I had a hard time hearing part of the question. so
Yeah,
go-
if you can, in one sentence, repeat.
I just couldn't.
Because, yeah, how likely is for the Huawei proposal to become a global standard?
I mean, that's, I don't have a good answer because I think it goes back to this kind of game theoretic notion of how this is going to play out and how the battles are going to play out. Depends on if Western democracies show up, if Qualcomm shows up, which I think they will. And I think, I don't know if, it's in the middle of this whole kind of battle around the US trying to control technology transfer to China, and the US and China's ability to build it internally and push that out to partner countries and states.
Yeah, I think for Huawei to succeed in this, what's needed is a strong technical case and the proof that what we are proposing is substantially better than what we have now. But as John said, I think even if they manage to say that what we are proposing is technically superior, I think that, for instance, the US would be very skeptical and would likely push back. So we have probably time for one more question. And
hope that we would have something that would make us sort of work faster in government, and we do. COVID brought it. I was in government when COVID hit,
And
but I'd
motivated
never
people to
seen
respond.
things work as smoothly. So that's sort of my first point. But I'm a venture capitalist, and I took a little bit of time off and served in government. And I was thinking on bringing federally funded innovation closer to venture capital, because it underlies everything in this country. And I know as VCs, we like to say, we did this and we pushed innovation through, but it's really Silicon Valley is a dream of the federal government. And nobody likes to admit that, but it's the truth. And if you go back and look at the research, it's sort of still there, including Apple. Everybody took government funding. Our issue is that people like myself won't go in early because it's too early and it's against my mandate. But we're dealing with, I think somebody sort of framed it as an ideological sort of difference. We're dealing with an entity on the other side that can say, we can send, students over, we can offer term sheets to companies that your taxpayer money has funded. DARPA has told me this, NASA has told me this. So I think there's an underlying sort of issue that's even below sort of the technical standard, because I think we will always sort of think about all of the different constituencies, and somebody can stand up and say, that's not right. And you're dealing with an entity that can say, no, this is what we're doing. It's sort of the one China sort of policy that sort of brought it up. So just.
I think that's true. I think that, just to give you an example, confirming, I think, a version of what you're talking about, the DoD reached out to me. And in last December, they created something called DoD. They created something called the Office of Strategic Capital. And the idea was that they wanted to look at technologies that had commercial potential, but also had important national security considerations. And they wanted to create a fund as a starting point where they could bring federal expertise to bear to help and ensure the development of those technologies. But the interesting thing was, to me, one, I think notionally it has a lot of value, but they fundamentally don't have the expertise. They're really bright people and really capable people, and they've never run a fund before. They don't know how a fund operates. I brought people from the business school over that I know who are entrepreneurs and have built funds and run funds. And the former dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences here to meet with them and kind of give them a sense of how this would need to work, and kind of, they don't have the ability to operate as VCs and get into the fund, the deal flow. Well, it's an interesting question, kind of what's the role of government in that situation, and how can they accelerate some of these activities in ways that are constructive? And then you've got the second part, which you said, taxpayers have invested in these things, but are they universally available so they can come in and be expropriated in some way, either legally or illegally, through systems, right? But it is a kind of, I mean, I don't want to sound grandiose, but it is a little bit of a battle of your philosophies about the role of government and authoritarian versus democratic systems and capitalist systems based on competition. Not a very encouraging comment, but.
Any other question or, okay, I think we can close it here.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming. We appreciate it very much.